I am so glad to be with you and very honored to be addressing a group of such dedicated and expert healthcare professionals. And I'm coming to speak with you today as the founder and chairman of the Committee to Reduce Infection Deaths, RID, Reduce Infection Deaths. We are a national campaign in the United States to prevent hospital infections. We only have one goal: to save lives. And I know that's why you're here too. I want to compliment you and your country because in your country, hospital infection is a front page issue. Every week I see stories on the front pages of your major newspapers about infants who contract infections in the NICU or elderly patients who contract infections during hip replacement. In the United States, these tragic issues are almost never covered in the mainstream press, and that is a major reason that I founded RID, to give a bully pulpit, a means of building public pressure and public support for cleaner hospitals and more dedication, more commitment to preventing infections. When I founded RID 14 years ago, not one state out of 50 in the United States even required hospitals to disclose their infection rates. Now I'm proud to say 38 out of 50 do. And working very closely with the administration of former President George W. Bush, we put the public health system for seniors, Medicare, on board. They now require hospitals to provide information so that they can be compared and that data are shared with the public. And in addition, Medicare now has an incentive system. They penalize hospitals by not paying them to treat infections that should not have occurred. So we're making progress, but you are way ahead of us. And that's why I'm so glad to be here. RID works closely with infection professionals in the United States to build the business case for prevention. We actually work with IPs on mathematical models that they can take to the C-suite and convince hospital heads to spend the money on prevention rather than paying more later to treat those infections. RID stands for two things and has from the beginning: screening and cleaning. Screening incoming patients to identify those who are carrying multi-drug resistant pathogens so that we can take the precautions to prevent those pathogens from spreading throughout the hospital, and also to take prophylactic precautions to protect the patients themselves, especially if they're undergoing surgery. And of course, cleaning, well, that's the topic of today's discussion. 14 years ago, believe it or not, there was very little emphasis on environmental hygiene. Let me say there was too much emphasis on hand hygiene, if that's possible. Too much emphasis. Of course, there were a few forward thinkers. One of the greatest was Stephanie Dancer from your country, who wrote very, very compelling research about the importance, the link between environmental contamination and HAIs, and in our country, John Boyce. But for the most part, a decade and a half ago, the emphasis was on hand hygiene rather than environmental hygiene, and that's what made RID's approach rather novel. Well, why was this so essential? It's obvious now, the research has made it obvious, that even if doctors and nurses clean their hands on the way into a room or before they approach the patient's bed, their hands become recontaminated, or their gloves, seconds later when they pull open that privacy curtain, probably the dirtiest item in the room, or put their hands on the bed rail or pull open a drawer. So, how clean are hospitals? Well, now there's copious research on the inadequacies inadequacies of hospital cleaning. Many research items in your country, and I'm just going to cite one in the United States that has attracted a lot of attention. This was a survey of 1,100 patient rooms up the east coast of the United States, from Washington to Trenton to New York to Stamford, Connecticut, New Haven, Connecticut, Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston. A survey done by Philip Carlin of Boston University and Michael Perry of Stamford Hospital in Connecticut. And they found that over half the objects in a patient's room that are supposed to be cleaned during a terminal cleaning were overlooked. Over half. In fact, one of the conclusions you'd have to reach is if you're going to eat your lunch in a hospital room, the best place to put your sandwich is on the toilet seat, because that is never overlooked. But just about everything else can be. Carlin and Perry also found, examining 49 ORs in 4 New England hospitals, that just about half the surfaces in the operating room that are supposed to be disinfected were also overlooked. There is a very close relationship, we now know, between environmental contamination and HAIs. One of the best studies in our country that has really linked these was done by Tufts University researchers examining the spread of vancomycin-resistant enterococcus. They found that one of the best predictors of which patients at Tufts University Medical Center contracted that bug was what room they were assigned to. If a patient was assigned to a room where a preceding patient, even 3 or 4 weeks before, was colonized or infected with VRE, the risk of this new patient getting it went way up. Can you imagine? Room assignment was a far more accurate predictor of who contracted VRE than the age of the patient or the diagnosis that brought the patient into the hospital. Now, of course, this problem of lingering bacteria and other pathogens can be mitigated through more thorough manual cleaning. For example, researchers at Rush Medical College in Chicago found, dealing with the very same pathogen, that if they work with the environmental services people to point out the frequently overlooked objects and the importance of the drenching and waiting rather than the quick spray and wipe, they could reduce the spread of VRE by 2/3. Yet, despite that success, that moderate success, the real way to mitigate human fallibility and the problem of inadequate cleaning is with automatic, continuous, non-toxic disinfection of the hospital environment. And I have to say, it's really wonderful to be in the UK, because here there is much more interest in automatic methods of hospital disinfection than in the US. We'll be working with the CDC and other federal agencies in the United States on this issue. But you here are far ahead in appreciating, evaluating, and actually putting into effect automatic methods of room disinfection and OR disinfection. And for that, kudos to you, right? But the existing methods in place now, such as UV light, hydrogen peroxide misting, they kill many of the pathogens, but they're not really practical, or they would be in much wider use. What makes them impractical? Well, first of all, they generally require dedicated, trained staff. Secondly, many of these methods don't get to every part of the environment. For example, UV light, it only goes directly in the line of sight. It won't get under the bed. It won't get behind the bureau. Thirdly, they're toxic. They can't be used while the medical staff and patients are in the room. And for that very reason as well, they are financially impractical because, let's face it, above the main floor, a hospital is just like a hotel. The rooms have to be turned over quickly. And the financial managers of the hospital are not going to allow a room to be out of use for 40 minutes or more, which is often what is required. And finally, there's not enough attention in most of these methods to the disinfection of the air as well as the surfaces. So a technology is needed that will mitigate all those problems. There's a very close relationship between air particle contamination and bioburden on surfaces. Why is that? Well, first of all, just foot traffic kicks up the particles on the floor and puts them back into the air. So dust that's contaminated with Staph aureus, for example, gets back into the air. Floor cleaning has been shown to make this a much bigger problem, especially in hospitals. We know that when a toilet is flushed, it aerosolizes C. diff spores and puts them into the air. And I will call your attention now to an article in the brand new issue of Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology, where carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter has been aerosolized while patients with that infection that are being treated on ventilators are treated. It gets into the air. And of course, we know with bed making too, as they shake the bedclothes, staph and other particles get into the air. So it's very important that we have automatic, continuous, non-toxic disinfection of surfaces and air to rid the hospital of these pathogens. And of course, the stakes are even higher when we talk about the operating room. It's generally assumed that the causes of surgical site infections begin with the microbiome of the patient, and then secondarily, the contamination of surgical instruments, and in last place, the OR environment. But there's quite a bit of new research to cause us to reassess that assumption. And I'm looking particularly, let's see if we put this up. Yes, I'm looking particularly at the International Society of Infectious Diseases' new guidelines, which call attention to air contamination is the major exogenous factor in causing SSIs. Now, I don't have a slide for this, but I would like to read it to you anyway. This is from Orthopedics and Traumatology Surgery and Research, February 2015 by Chavot. Contamination by airborne microorganisms plays a central role in the pathogenesis of SSIs. SSIs due to intraoperative contamination are chiefly ascribable to airborne particles carrying microorganisms, mainly Staphylococcus aureus, which settle on the surgeon's hands and instruments. SSI prevention therefore rests on minimization of airborne contaminated particle counts. Now, one of the most interesting and compelling pieces of data is from the Journal of Hospital Infection in 2003, a look at 62 hip replacement surgeries that became infected. And the conclusion from this research, which I think is up there now, yes. Amazingly, only 2% of these infections were attributable to the patient's own microbiome. Almost all was due to contamination of the air and the settling of those contaminated particles either directly on the wound or on the surgeon's hands and instruments and thereafter transferred to the wound. So we have to conclude that the precautions currently being taken in the operating room to prevent this are inadequate. Let's look at these strategies. Well, we've got skull caps, in some cases even helmets, not working. Disinfection of hard and soft surfaces, I referred to the Carlin and Perry study earlier, inadequate. Limiting door openings and the number of personnel in the operating room, also not enough. Attention to air changes per hour, even at 20 or 25 air changes per hour, clearly not enough. Limiting the time the instrument tray is exposed, not enough. And most important, perhaps, since we're going to be talking about implants in a second, laminar airflow. For many, this was going to be the remedy. Not enough. In fact, I'd like to call your attention to a study in Surgeon 2015 on just this topic, laminar airflow. We thought it would be enough, but there are so many reasons that this top-to-bottom airflow is interrupted and becomes turbulent and doesn't work to prevent the particles from being deposited on the wound or on the surgeon's hands or on the instruments. So what is lacking? Air disinfection. That is the answer to this problem. And of course, with implants, even more so, even more urgently needed. Virtually all surgical disciplines now, on occasion, involve device implantation. And we know that the number of colony-forming units needed to cause an SSI is dramatically lower when an implant, a device, a foreign body is involved. I'm referring now to Charles Edmiston's very important work. And he writes in the American Journal of Infection Control, November 2017, microbial contamination of air in the OR is an underappreciated factor in the etiology of perioperative joint infection. And he urges that future consideration should be given to institutional investment in innovative air purification technology to reduce the risk of perioperative joint infection. Now is the time to do this. With the aging of the baby booming generation, we see an explosive growth in the number of hip and knee replacement surgeries and other implants. The financial and human cost of infection is mounting. We have the technology to solve this problem. Dilute hydrogen peroxide. It's automatic, it's continuous, it's non-toxic, and it addresses both surface and air contamination. I have to say, it's a bit astounding, but on my side of the pond, there's insufficient attention to or interest in the quality of air in operating rooms. Believe it or not, we have so many regulations that govern pharmaceutical manufacturing, all the specs for what a clean room should look like. Computer assembly, same thing. Even food processing plants. It's hard to believe, but in the US, the standards for making a hot dog are far higher than the standards for cutting up grandma. So, in closing, let me just say this. 4 years ago, my organization, Reduce Infection Deaths, awarded the engineer responsible for developing dilute hydrogen peroxide our prestigious Ignaz Semmelweis Award. This award goes only to the most promising new technologies, and we award it only once every few years. But even then, I knew, and my board of prominent physicians at RID knew, that DHP is a game changer. And we weren't the only ones to recognize its enormous potential in medicine. The Association of Professionals in Infection Control, APIC, also awarded DHP's innovators its prestigious William Rutala Award. So now it's up to you. We have the knowledge, we have the technology to tame hospital infections with automatic, non-toxic disinfection of the air and surfaces. And I know you have the will, the commitment to get it done. Thank you for all you do.